to announce that their governments have accepted the United States proposal to end the devastating conflict between Israel and Hezbollah.
De-escalating tensions in the region, it can also help us to end the conflict in Gaza. In particular, Hamas will know that it can't count on other fronts opening up in the war.
There is going to be a mass deportation because we just finished a mass illegal immigration crisis on the border.
Hello, I'm Robert Costa in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. We start tonight with breaking news. A ceasefire has been agreed to between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. President Biden made the announcement that the United States has secured the deal.
Today, I have some good news to report from the Middle East. I just spoke with the Prime Minister of Israel and Lebanon. I'm pleased to announce that their governments have accepted the United States proposal to end the devastating conflict between Israel and Hezbollah.
Meanwhile, back here at home, President-elect Trump, he's focusing on two election promises. Trump border czar Tom Homan on the southern border today, promising the largest deportation program in history. Trump also pledged to impose hefty tariffs on two of our biggest trading partners, Canada and Mexico, as well as China. We'll take a look at how those countries are responding to the president-elect's threat, and if Trump can get Congress eventually on his side on this trade position. We'll also get to more on the transition ahead, but we start with the Middle East and that ceasefire deal. Scott MacFarlane joins us from the White House. Charlie D'Agata is at the Pentagon. Charlie, let's begin with you over at the Pentagon. Now that this deal seems to be in place, what happens next?
Yeah, Bob, for starters, it's an end to hostilities in roughly 4 hours' time, 4 a.m. local time. You've seen the intensity of the bombardment Israel has been unleashing on suspected Hezbollah targets right up to the end. So U.S. officials tells us what comes next is it'll be a 10-day period for Israeli troops to start withdrawing from southern Lebanon. That's to be completed within 60 days. Why so long? It's going to take some time for the Lebanese army to fill that void. We're talking around roughly 5,000 troops, and they just simply don't have the capacity to do it, officials tell me here. Hezbollah has already been pushed north of the Litani River. That happened today, as a matter of fact. That's not just symbolic, but under a previous agreement back in 2006, that sort of natural geographical boundary was where Hezbollah was supposed to stay north of. So that's now part of this deal. In remarks today, without going into detail, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned that any violation of that deal would be met with, his words, a forceful response. So it's now just up to the Lebanese army, the UN force, UNIFIL, to control that territory. And there will be a component of U.S. International monitors, including the U.S. monitors. But it means roughly 60 to 70,000 displaced Israelis can go home, as well as thousands of Lebanese residents eventually.
And Charlie, if you don't mind, stick with you for a moment here. What's the impact, if any, on the ongoing conflict in Gaza? And does this play any role in shaping how those negotiations could eventually take place?
Well, as far as the Biden administration is concerned, they absolutely see this as a catalyst. And we also have to remember that, Iran has been briefed on this peace deal because Hezbollah is part of their proxy. So neither Hezbollah or Iran are in any kind of, negotiating strength. And there's been a lot of retaliation. It's coming a 1-2 punch from Hezbollah and Iran itself. As far as ceasefire in Gaza, it removes a powerful weapon in a sort of partnership with Hezbollah. The Israelis see this as two separate fights, but Hezbollah had said that they wouldn't stop fighting until the war in Gaza was over. They've obviously dropped that demand. So Israelis are hoping this will leave Hamas more isolated. But again, U.S. officials said there's going to be some shuttle diplomacy happening. This is what President Biden himself said, in places like Turkey and Qatar, to serve as a catalyst to bring an end to the fighting in Gaza and to bring those hostages home.
Scott, you're over at the White House. President Biden addressed this plan this afternoon. Let's take a listen.
Under the deal reached today, effective at 4 a.m. tomorrow local time, the fighting across the Lebanese-Israeli border will end. This is designed to be a permanent cessation of hostilities. what is left of Hezbollah and other terrorist organizations will not be allowed, well, I emphasize, will not be allowed to threaten the security of Israel again.
Scott, what's the mood over there among your sources close to President Biden as they digest this information? This is the final stage of the Biden presidency, yet a lot seems to be happening on the foreign policy front.
This happens at a particularly sensitive moment, doesn't it, Bob, where you're in the middle of a transition from one administration to the next, and you have this international diplomatic victory, but one that isn't secured immediately. It's a process. It's going to take 2 months for the move out of some troops and the move in of others. That this is a process that needs to be ongoing has been emphasized through the day here at the White House and by the administration. But this has also been a priority of the administrations. We know that the president talked with the president of France on Friday, and the White House has ascribed credit to France for helping to secure this ceasefire agreement. The Biden administration officials with whom we've been speaking over the past few months have emphasized this is a priority. What's more, they've said unequivocally that not only is a ceasefire agreement needed to end the fighting, but that there needs to be a security plan to make sure Israelis feel comfortable moving back to the northern regions of the country, back to the border areas. I think you saw President Biden synthesize a lot of that into his statement today. This is a triumphant moment of sorts for President Biden, but he has undoubtedly, Bob, also pulled a crisis potentially off the plates of his successor.
Scott, a U.S. official also tells CBS News that President-elect Trump and his advisors have been briefed about this arrangement. What are you hearing about those discussions?
A few different things. First of all, the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, speaking in Italy at the G7 conference, said that there are conversations and lines of communication already open between him and Marco Rubio, the Florida senator who is Trump's designee to be his Secretary of State nominee, the Secretary of State who would take over this issue in the Middle East. That line of communication is open. Here's another line of communication that's open. The Trump campaign and transition has triumphantly said that the Hezbollah figures in the Middle East, the proxies for Iran, heard the clock ticking toward the beginning of the Trump administration, January 20th, and that might have leveraged this deal too. Not sure the White House would agree with that, but at some point soon, the Trump team is taking over the Middle East.
Charlie D'Agata and Scott McFarland, two first-rate correspondents. Appreciate your time and your reporting. Now to that Trump transition. Correspondent Nicole Killian in West Palm Beach, Florida tonight. Nicole, great to see you. What are you hearing down there in Florida about how this ceasefire is playing out at Mar-a-Lago?
Yeah, well, as you just reported, we do know, according to a U.S. official, that the Trump team was briefed on this. However, administration officials say that really a lot of these negotiations began in earnest well before the election. So from that standpoint, they weren't necessarily involved in the negotiations part of things, but certainly were kept abreast of the developments. And that being said, we are hearing from a Trump-Vance transition official who tells us that President Trump has been crystal clear that his support for Israel and his commitment to peace in the Middle East is steadfast, also adding that Hezbollah understands this is their best opportunity to get a more favorable deal done, and going on to say that Iran-backed proxies clearly see the clock ticking as President Trump will soon return to the White House. We have also heard from other members within the president-elect's orbit, including Michael Waltz, who has been named to serve as part of the president's national security team. And he also, is kind of suggesting that a lot of this is happening because President-elect Trump will be coming into office soon. So there's a little bit of spin depending on, which side you talk to in terms of the Biden White House versus the Trump transition team. But certainly a sense of relief that this deal has finally been done.
Nicole, what are you hearing about Tom Homan, the border czar, who was in Texas today with the Republican Governor Greg Abbott? Let's first listen to him giving a fiery speech. Here's what Tom Homan had to say.
For the last 4 years, I wake up every morning pissed off about what this administration did to the most secure border in my lifetime. Let me be clear. I worked for 6 presidents, starting with Ronald Reagan. Every president I worked for took steps to secure the border because they understood you can't have strong national security if you don't have border security.
So, Nicole, you have Tom Homan, even before January 20th, 2025. He's out in front on this border policy, the looming migration policy when it comes to mass deportation. Stephen Miller, the incoming deputy White House chief of staff, among others, has a lot of influence. Kristi Noem, the nominee for Department of Homeland Security. But it's Homan who's out there. Homan who seems to be in the spotlight. What do you make of that, and what does your reporting tell you?
Yeah, well, certainly very significant. I mean, obviously, as someone who is going to become the incoming border czar, this is particular priority of the president-elect's, and certainly he has made clear in terms of his agenda that he doesn't necessarily want to waste any time and wants to really hit the ground running. So a visit like this today to Texas at the border with Governor Abbott is certainly essential to trying to get up to speed in terms of being ready to put some of these policies in place on day one, including, as you mentioned, the president-elect has been very clear that he wants to move very aggressively with respect to this mass deportation plan, even as, you know, many question how all of this will come together in short order. And furthermore, we know that Homan has been very no nonsense when it comes to policies around the border. So that's part of why you saw him there in Texas today.
Nicole Killian, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. A federal court has agreed to dismiss the classified documents case against President-elect Donald Trump. Special counsel Jack Smith filed a motion yesterday for the case looking into Trump's handling and asked for it to be dropped. He cited Trump's re-election in November earlier this month and a policy that sitting presidents cannot be prosecuted or indicted by the Justice Department. The incoming president, the president-elect, was charged for leaving top-secret documents unsecured, allegedly around his Florida estate. A judge also agreed to dismiss the 2020 federal election interference case, the January 6th case, against Trump yesterday. Meanwhile, Harris-Walz campaign leaders, they're speaking out about the defeat of the vice president. Next, our political panel weighs in on this internal assessment now going public about what went wrong. You're streaming America Decides. In politics, after any campaign, there's a lot of what we call Monday morning quarterbacking, people wondering what went wrong. That's happening again. The Harris-Walz campaign leaders speaking out this week about what happened. Here is some of what they told Pod Save America.
You know, the political atmosphere was pretty brutal, and that's not an excuse. You had right track, wrong track, I think 28-72, about 70% of the country saying they were angry.
You know, we already knew how to do the negative on Trump, and we knew that there was a lot of Trumpnesia out there. People didn't remember the 4 years of the Trump administration.
The idea that people have just a well-constructed, already baked-in idea about Trump and they don't need to learn any more is just complete fallacy. I mean, his numbers are stronger today than they have ever been.
We have a great political panel here. Joel Payne and Tricia McLaughlin. Joel is CBS News political contributor and a Democratic strategist. Tricia joining us remotely, a Republican strategist. She served as a senior advisor and the communications director for Vivek Ramaswamy's presidential campaign. Tricia, we're going to begin with you, the Republican looking in on these Democrats talking amongst themselves. What do you make of it?
Yeah, this post-mortem interview really was reminiscent almost of a Kamala Harris interview as far as nothing was actually said. They didn't really answer the questions at hand, and there was not a lot of interview pushback whatsoever. I think that this election really did come down to the issues. 75% of Americans said that this country was on the wrong track, and yet their candidate, Kamala Harris, was really unwilling or unable to create any daylight with Joe Biden, whether it be on inflation. What would she actually have done to drive down prices? Would she have continued to pass the Inflation Reduction Act, which we know poured trillions of dollars into the economy? And B, immigration. She might have said she would be tough on the border, but she didn't give really a reason why they would let 10 to 15 million people into this country illegally. So I think that there was a trust issue as well with voters.
So that's a Republican perspective. Tricia, appreciate that. Let's get a Democratic perspective. Joel, what struck me in terms of the Democratic side of this is you had a podcast in Pod Save America hosted by former advisors to President Barack Obama. Many people who were part of the Biden campaign, but especially the Harris campaign, also former advisors to President Obama. So you have this kind of meeting of the minds of people in the Obama orbit, shall we say. What is the view inside the Democratic Party about that Obama crowd and whether they are bearing responsibility fully, and should they continue to have such influence in the Democratic in the Democratic Party?
Oh, Bob, there are a lot of tough questions being asked within the party right now. I know several of those folks who were part of that interview. Jen O'Malley Dillon, 16 years ago, I worked for her. It's one of the smartest minds in politics, party agnostic. So I can vouch for those folks. Nobody sounds particularly smart or, like they've got all the answers after a loss, like the loss that Democrats suffered a few weeks ago at the ballot box. I think that some of the things that they said were not particularly surprising. They made good points, particularly about super PACs, how Republicans had an advantage with the outside spending versus Democrats. They talked about how Kamala Harris had to start the race really 15, 20 points behind on key issues like the economy and her personal favorability. And they talked about growth that they made in both of those directions during the race, but they just simply didn't have enough time. And with a candidate with the unique challenges she had in this cycle, it's not surprising where we landed. I thought they acquitted themselves as well as you can acquit yourself. But again, nobody seems like they cover themselves with glory when you're talking about a loss like that.
Tricia, when you look at your own political experience working for the Ramaswamy campaign as a top advisor, he's now working with President-elect Trump on government cuts across the board in an outside way, but still working formally with the transition. The Trump culture dominates the Republican Party, just like the Obama orbit in many ways. Maybe doesn't dominate the Democratic Party, but certainly has a heavy influence. Do you believe the Republican Party now is still fully in Trump's image? And what are the upsides and downsides to having that kind of culture, a candidate or a person or a president so central in a party?
I think that the mandate that Donald Trump was given on November 5th, it does change the trajectory generationally for the Republican Party, him winning the popular vote when that hasn't been done since the 80s for a Republican. That being said, I think that we saw something very different this go around with a change in coalition, as far as you have Tulsi Gabbard, you have RFK, you have people who were not loyal to Donald Trump in the primary. That includes my boss, Vivek Ramaswamy, who ran against him. So while I think it's going to change the Republican Party and more into a working class populist party. And I think that's cemented. It's no longer the party of Mitt Romney. And because of that mandate, it's really here to stay, that populism.
And Joel, just to finish us up here, can you respond to her point? Former Democratic Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, now part of the Trump coalition. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. from a famous Democratic family, now part of the Trump coalition. Are Democrats grappling with how that more libertarian, independent, minded at least, Democrat has in some capacity migrated over to the Republican side?
Every smart Democrat I've talked to since the election understands that the current trend lines for where the coalitions are going don't work in our favor. You've got to grow your base of working class support. There are working class plans that Democrats have for the American people that just aren't reaching them in the way that they need to. And I think some retooling is required. I do want to quarrel with one thing Tricia said, mandate. I think as the votes continue to come in and as we really get a full picture of what happened on election night, I think we've got to reassess what we mean when we say mandate. Did Donald Trump win? Yes. Did he win a majority? It appears? Yes. But Donald Trump has a mandate from the American people to keep the economy strong, which Joe Biden has handed him a strong economy, not to bring chaos and disorder and extremism to the American folks.
We're going to have...
And yeah, that's what I would push back on.
Tricia, we have to leave it there. We'll have you back soon with Joel, hopefully, and we'll continue this discussion, maybe even have a little bit of a debate. But for now, we have to leave it there. Thanks to you both for coming on our program. Thank you. Down in Florida, Eric Trump, the son of the president-elect, says a longtime aide to his father will, quote, no longer be around if supposed allegations regarding his conduct are found out to be true. It's an intriguing story about what's going on with this transition. We're still gathering the facts, reporting it out. What Boris Epshteyn is being accused of by some in the Trump coalition. You're hearing that more in the coming minutes on America Decides. That's coming up. The Trump transition team down in Florida now says it's moving ahead after conducting a review into allegations that longtime advisor to President-elect Trump, Boris Epshteyn, might have attempted to use his influence over cabinet picks and get a personal profit. Former Missouri Governor Eric Greitens submitted a sworn declaration alleging Epshteyn led him to believe he must, quote, engage in business dealings with him. To be recommended for a role in the upcoming administration, Epshteyn has denied those claims. Our own Dan Klaidman joins us now. Dan, thanks for being here. Let's begin, Dan, by listening to Eric Trump the president-elect's son, talk about this situation.
I've known Boris for years, and I've never known him to be anything but a good human being. So that said, I will tell you, my father has been incredibly clear. You do not do that under any circumstance. And believe me, there will be repercussions if somebody was. So I've never seen that side of him. I've known him for a very long time. And, I certainly hope the reporting's false. And I can also tell you, if it's true, the person will probably no longer be around.
Dan, great to have you here. Let's step back for a second. So Boris Epshteyn, he is someone who is well known to people who cover President-elect Trump. People who've covered him for a long time knows he's a constant presence, especially on the legal side of the Trump world, in terms of advising Trump on his legal challenges, whether it be his legal team, getting lawyers to help him out with the criminal investigations, the civil trials, et cetera. Boris also has a personal relationship with Eric Trump. They went to college together here in Washington. And he is someone who's really become a confidant of Trump going back now at least 5, 6, 7 years, if not more, going back to the 2016 campaign. He was working very closely with Rudy Giuliani in 2020 when Trump was contesting the 2020 election. So with all of that backstory, what have you learned in your reporting about what Epstein is being accused of by some Trump allies of doing during this transition?
Yeah, well, what we learned was that there was a tremendous amount of concern within the Trump transition about Boris Epstein doing exactly this and approaching multiple people to solicit financial payment in exchange for helping them get appointments or nominations. We focused on Eric Greitens, as you mentioned in the introduction, because we were able to along with our partner from Just the News, a conservative outlet, obtain a copy of this sworn declaration. I interviewed Greitens. He said that he was quite concerned about the interactions that he had with Epstein, that it was clear to him that Epstein was seeking financial payment in exchange for securing some kind of a nomination or appointment for Greitens. And Greitens told me that he wanted to bring this to the transition because he wanted to protect the president, because he was concerned about the ethics of all of this. But there were other examples that others have also reported on, including Scott Bessent, who is the nominee for Treasury Secretary, who was also allegedly approached by Boris Epstein. They had a confrontation, apparently, somewhere in Mar-a-Lago about this. So word was getting around, and ultimately, Susie Wiles, the co-campaign manager who's working on the transition, brought in a lawyer to investigate and review these claims, and then the story broke.
Are you hearing anything from federal officials or investigators about what could be on the horizon here, if anything?
We have not heard that there is any federal investigation into this. And I think it's important to note that this review was not a criminal investigation. It is more of an ethical investigation. It's not clear at all that anything that Boris Epstein did would have been illegal. I mean, this is the kind of lobbying that you often see in Washington. I have to say, I haven't seen it inside a transition. And so, so I think this may rise to another level. The idea of selling appointments or profiting on these kinds of appointments is new, as far as I know, but certainly not criminal.
Dan Kleitman, thank you for your reporting. We appreciate it. I'm sure this story will continue. We'll keep tabs on it. Now to a key member of the Trump transition, the upcoming administration visiting the southern border. We've talked about it a little bit so far, and we'll talk about it more. Why Tom Homan is making this trip to the border more than a month before his job officially begins. You're streaming America Decides. President-elect Donald Trump's incoming border czar spoke to Texas National Guard soldiers and public safety troopers on the border today. Tom Homan promised to help implement what is being billed as the largest deportation program in U.S. history, just on the horizon once Trump takes office next year. CBS News immigration and politics reporter Camilo Montoya Galvez is at the border tonight. Camilo, Always good to see you. Appreciate your reporting. What are you hearing from Homan? You study this immigration issue. You report on the border and policymakers on this front. Homan has a lot of tough talk. What's behind the tough talk?
Well, Bob, incoming border czar Tom Homan and Governor Abbott of Texas did not come here to the U.S.-Mexico border just to give out turkey to National Guard soldiers. They also came here effectively to announce that the state of Texas and the incoming Trump administration will work closely together and carefully on the issue of immigration and border policy. As you know, Governor Abbott over the past 3 years has been making an aggressive stance on immigration, busing tens of thousands of migrants to Democratic-led cities and deploying thousands of troops and state troopers to the U.S.-Mexico border to fortify it with razor wire and other barriers. And he is now effectively offering all that manpower and resources to the incoming administration, who, as you know, Bob, is promising a flurry and slew of executive actions on immigration and border policy, including the largest deportation operation in American history. And some people, like Stephen Miller, the incoming deputy chief of staff at the White House, have talked about the idea of deputizing the National Guard in friendly states to arrest and deport migrants who are in the country illegally. Texas, of course, Bob, would, of course, be a friendly state who could potentially collaborate with the incoming administration on that front. And Homan said today that that mass deportation operation will happen because he argues there has been a mass illegal immigration crisis here at the U.S.-Mexico border. And finally, Bob, he issued a stark warning to so-called sanctuary cities that limit cooperation with federal immigration authorities. He said that it is illegal to harbor or conceal undocumented immigrants, saying, quote, "Don't test us."
Camila Montoya Galvez, thank you. He's reporting for us at the border. For more on this, let's bring in our panel. Dave Weigel, a politics reporter for Semaphore. Nicholas Wu is a congressional reporter for Politico. Dave, let's begin with you. We heard from Pod Save America today, some of these Harris advisors talking about what went wrong. As Democrats look ahead and they hear Tom Homan and other Trump people talk about the border policy, talk about mass deportations, what's the Democrats' plan? Is it going to be protests in the streets, real mass outcry on Capitol Hill, or is it going to be something else? What are you hearing?
Well, it depends on what their job is. For Democratic governors, Democratic mayors, to the extent available to them, because some of their states, if you're a mayor, have made it impossible to become a sanctuary city, they're going to resist having their law enforcement used to assist ICE. They've been doing that for 20 years in some places. So how does that resistance break down? What clashes do they get into? That's a question for municipal officials and for governors. For Democrats in Congress, there are going to be bills that have components they voted for in the past that they'll be asked to vote on in really the next few months, January, once they get here. And they'll have a choice to make. What do they want to be associated with? Every Democrat does have a memory of how unpopular these border enforcement actions were when Donald Trump was president the first time. That's a reason their party moved to the left. So there's a wait and see attitude by those who can wait and see. The governors and mayors are already saying, here are the things we're not going to help you with.
Nicholas, what about on Capitol Hill? When you're covering Congress, what are they preparing for, both on the Republican side and the Democratic side, in terms of how the executive branch is going to be handling this versus how Congress is going to be handling this?
Well, right now on Capitol Hill, what we're seeing is Republicans start to lay the groundwork for what they could do policy-wise next year on immigration. There's talk among Republicans of trying to use, this fast-track legislative process known as reconciliation to try to include immigration and border enforcement provisions in the same way that Democrats had tried to use that several years back to include protections for Dreamers. Now, for Democrats, what they're going through right now is this whole post-election reckoning, including a series of closed-door listening sessions between members of Congress and their leadership. And what we've seen among quite a few Democratic lawmakers is that they've looked to purple district lawmakers like Tom Suozzi of New York and Don Davis of North Carolina, who really took the issue of immigration and ran with it and responded to Republican attacks on the border. And that is something that we could perhaps see a lot from Democrats over the coming years.
Dave, what about when it comes to trade? Are you hearing any murmurs from Republicans in the Senate about President-elect Trump and what he's doing?
No, it's been pretty supine, pretty favorable. Again, wait and see.
especially among Republicans who, even if they trust everything Donald Trump said on the campaign trail regards to immigration, regards to judicial appointments, they have not come to grips with how serious he is about tariffs. So there's some pushback. The impulse a lot of Republicans have learned last time is that if you make if the market show that something is unpopular for Donald Trump, he can be moved off that. If people are lacking confidence, if the dollar is weakening, if there's a stock sell-off, a large stock sell-off, that moves the president to the position they want him to get away from. Sorry, that moves the president away from the position that they want him to get away from. But right now, no, he's got a lot of people who were not there last time, or people who joined the Senate in the Trump era previously, who are inclined to give him what he wants. He's not going to get the same kind of resistance you saw when Bob Corker was in the Senate, Lamar Alexander, Mitt Romney were in the Senate and loudly using their microphones to say, we're going to resist him. They're kind of waiting on other actors to do the resisting for them.
And Nicholas, on this point, putting you on the spot a little bit here, who's one Republican in the Senate you are constantly watching to really get a sense of where things are going, and who's one Democrat in the Senate?
I think among Republicans, I'd be curious to see where the wind blows with the real moderate decision makers, like Susan Collins of Maine, one of the few, blue state Republicans who's still there, and so it's that'll give us a good sense of where she lands. As for Democrats, I'm curious to see how people like Chris Murphy of Connecticut, someone who's really tried to reinvent his own standing in the party. He's been talking a lot these days about neoliberalism, and he'll be an interesting voice to watch in the Trump era.
We're going to have to leave it there. Gentlemen, Dave Weigel and Nicholas Wu, thank you for your reporting. We appreciate it. President-elect Trump says he will take executive action on day one to impose major tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China. That's been causing a lot of talk, at least in Washington, about how that's going to play out, as Dave Weigel and Nick were just discussing. But what does it mean for consumers when you're out there processing trade policy? What does it mean for your own experience when you're at the grocery store and you're looking at products that are maybe coming in from Canada or Mexico or China? What does it mean for you? We'll have more on that coming up straight ahead. You're streaming America Decides.
You want to allow drugs to come through our southern border? We're going to tariff you. You want to allow them to come through Canada? We're going to tariff you. We are going to cost your countries, your economies. We're going to cost your businesses billions, hundreds of billions of dollars.
That was Eric Trump, the son of President-elect Trump, defending his father's promise to impose major tariffs on goods from the United States' three largest trading partners. The president-elect has justified this position as what he believes is an effort to curb migration and the flow of fentanyl into the United States. He's been making that case publicly. Trump is now threatening to add 25% on tariffs, 25% tariffs on goods from Canada and Mexico, plus an extra 10% on goods from China. He was already, I believe, based on our reporting, proposing 60% tariffs on Chinese goods. To discuss all of this and the economic and political impact, Mario Parker joins us now. He is a Bloomberg News managing editor and focused on the economy and government. Let's begin, Mario, by looking at what the Canadian leader Justin Trudeau had to say about all of this.
I had a good call with Donald Trump last night again. We obviously talked about laying out the facts, talking about how the intense and effective connections between our two countries flow back and forth. This is a relationship that we know takes a certain amount of working on, and that's what we'll do.
So you hear Prime Minister Trudeau. Do you believe Canada, Mexico, China will retaliate on these tariffs, or at least these promises, come next year?
Well, what you heard from Prime Minister Trudeau was a little bit of muscle memory there, right? He's gone through round one with Trump. He sees how this has gone before. In terms of his rhetoric hasn't been as tense as, say, the Sheinbaum's has, right? Where she surprisingly— The
Mexican leader.
Yes, the Mexican president. Where she said that essentially no one wins in a trade war. However, expect some tariffs and pain to be inflicted on both sides. And then, of course, China with its rhetoric saying that, again, similarly, no one wins in a trade war. But we've seen the tit-for-tat trade war between Washington and Beijing that marked Trump's first term here in Washington.
What's notable about what Trump is saying, if anything, on China? I mean, he's already proposed sweeping tariffs. What do you make of the escalation?
Well, I interviewed President Trump over the summer, and it was remarkable just how much he thought that tariffs were the panacea for anything that he has to confront him in terms of geopolitics, right? We saw whether or not there were mixed results from the first trade war, right?
What did he say to you?
He talked about that tariffs are a way to level the playing field, that he's been able to avert wars that we don't know about or conflicts that we don't know about due to the threat of tariffs before, how tariffs are, the American people or economists have it wrong, right? This is what he's saying. Economists say that this will lead to inflation here in the U.S. President Trump is saying that actually, on the contrary, tariffs are a wash. And again, that they solve all of the problems. You heard him say that they would be used to fund some of the pay-fors for his tax cuts that he's presented as well. In terms of the relationship with China specifically, what is surprising, again, he's been signaling that he's going to do this for a while. What is surprising is that now he's saying, essentially, if you add on 10% to the 60% he's already proposed, now we're looking at about upwards of 70% in tariffs before he even is inaugurated into office.
What do you make, though, of the president-elect talking a big game on tariffs, but two of the biggest proponents of tariffs in his circle, Peter Navarro and Robert Lighthizer, have yet to be named to the administration?
It is remarkable that Lighthizer, because he was the architect of the first go-round with the tariffs, whether or not, we'll see whether or not the administration is still coming together. He's named some of his key economic advisors so far. We'll see whether or not Lighthizer has a role in the administration. Navarro will probably have a role in the administration in some part as well.
Does Congress have a role in trade policy anymore or not?
And that's what we'll see, right? We'll see whether or not the Republicans have a majority here and whether or not the Senate, the House, will be the rubber stamp that Donald Trump expects it to be. We saw some pushback with some of the nominations, one in particular over the last few days. Whether or not Congress goes along with this, because what you have to remember, as you well know, is the economic pain that will be inflicted. Round one, a lot of the economic pain was inflicted in the heartland. These countries know how to strategically and surgically pinpoint parts of Donald Trump's base. Whether or not those Congress folks who are associated with those districts are willing to take on the pain will be something we'll have to see.
Sounds like a trade skirmish on the horizon, if not a trade war. We'll see. Mario Parker, thank you. We appreciate it. And Latino voters, they did play a critical role in delivering President-elect Trump's victory in the eyes of Republicans. Our next guest will share his perspective on what drove Latino voters, at least in some quarters, toward Trump. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Latino voters moved toward President-elect Trump in this year's election, an unexpected shift for that voting bloc that many in the political world are still trying to comprehend. A new article in The New Yorker, aptly titled "Understanding Latino Support for Donald Trump," offers a potential explanation. Its writer joins us now. Geraldo Cadava is a professor of history and Latino studies for Northwestern University, and he is a contributing writer at The New Yorker. Professor, great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Professor, in your piece, you write, quote, "If we learn anything between now and the next election, it should be that there is no prescribed path for Latinos." This statement essentially summarizes how you see the Latino vote. Can you dig a little bit deeper into what you're talking about and what you've assessed?
Sure. I think for the past couple of election cycles, I think we've been greeted by surprise at the fact that a significant share of Latinos have supported Republicans. And the only reason we've been surprised is because we've been, conditioned to expect that the overwhelming number of Latinos, percentage of Latinos, is going to vote for the Democratic candidate. And I think it's time that we just kind of abandon that assumption and almost start from scratch and understand Latinos as a swing vote that all candidates are going to have to fight for from now until 2026 in the midterms and 2028 in the next presidential election.
You also write about how some in the political world are looking at the Latinos somewhat shifting towards President-elect Trump. And you write, quote, "It is absolutely, let's look at the quote here, absolutely possible for Latinos to understand racism and still vote for a racist candidate whom they think rightly or wrongly will help them prosper." Explain what you meant by that conclusion.
Yeah, right after the election, many commentators started heaping blame upon Latinos. African-American commentators, for example, were saying, like, Black voters, we did our job, but Latinos failed to do theirs. I'm paraphrasing what they said. And I think that that's just the wrong way to look at it, because there's this debate emerged about how could so many Latinos, knowing everything we know about Donald Trump and what he has said about immigrants in particular, how could they possibly support this candidate? And I think that is really just the wrong way to think about it, because voters are complicated, and to support someone who you think will be better for your pocketbook in the bottom line does not necessarily mean that you don't understand that they can be racist at the same time. I think they're making very complicated decisions about what to prioritize. And I think it doesn't require you to deny racism in order to support someone who you think will be better for you and your family economically.
What about the influence of your late grandfather and how his example has helped inform your own perspective?
Yeah, I think he's someone that I grew up alongside, arguing about politics. He and I disagreed all the time, and he would tell me about his experience of discrimination, both in the military when he served in the Air Force, and he was repeatedly passed over for promotions. And then he continued to experience racism after the military when he worked in a copper mine and washing dishes at a country club in Arizona. And it's not that he, and it's important to note that he voted for every Republican presidential candidate from Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump. And I think he is kind of the basis of so much of my thinking about how complicated Latino conservatives are. And I think the benefit of him being my grandfather and me being able to spend hours as a child by his bedside listening to the stories he told is that I was never inclined to automatically demonize people who had political beliefs that were different than my own. And I could hear him tell his stories about what he believed in, why he felt the way that he did. And he never denied racism. He never bought into these other theories about what Latinos who voted for conservatives wanted. Many will say that they aspire to be white or something like that, or they've bought into the misogyny and racism of the Republican Party. And I don't think that's the case with him. I think he had a pretty clear-eyed understanding of all of those things at the same time that he was a Republican, because first, Ronald Reagan promised to put money back into his paycheck in the form of tax cuts, but then just thought over time, his views became increasingly conservative, where he bought kind of wholesale all positions of the Republican Party when it came to patriotism, social welfare reform, and immigration restrictions.
Professor Geraldo Cadava, really appreciate you stopping by and having this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
That does it for us today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report starts right now.